Have you ever felt like you lived your whole life and still never really lived? I have. For a very long time. I felt like I was just a reflection of what others expected from me. An efficient wife, a devoted mother, a quiet woman. I spent decades getting everything right, without ever asking myself what I wanted, without ever allowing myself to feel pleasure without guilt, and even less, to be seen as someone who could still be desired. On the outside, I was always in control, but inside, there was a huge silence where presence should have been, a body I had forgotten, a heart that only knew how to care for others, but no one cared for it. Today, at 66, I finally understand. It's not too late. It never was. Life didn't pass me by. It just waited for me. And when it came back, it brought me something I thought no longer belonged to me. The pleasure of being touched with respect, being looked at with tenderness, of being discovered with time, with truth, and with desire. And I want to tell you how all of this happened. But first, you need to know who I was, so you can understand who I became. Leave a comment below. Do you believe it's still possible to discover new forms of love and pleasure after 60? If this story touches your heart, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Every week, you'll find stories here that warm the soul and celebrate life. For a long time, my life felt like an old portrait hanging on the wall. Still, lovely from afar, but dusty and forgotten by the one living inside it. My marriage lasted 35 years. 35. And for almost all of that time, I was exactly what people expected from a wife. I woke up early, took care of the house, the kids, the bills, the birthdays, the folded laundry, and the forced smiles. Robert, my ex-husband, was the kind of man who took pride in being a good provider. And maybe, for many, that was enough. But the truth is, he never really saw me. He never touched me with care, never asked if I was happy, and more than anything, never cared if I felt pleasure. At first I thought it was normal. We had 3 small children, bills to pay, and a routine so exhausting that intimacy became a quiet obligation. Robert came to me when he wanted, and it was always quick, mechanical, detached. When he was done, he turned over and went to sleep. And me? I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember when exactly I disappeared from myself. Over time, my body stopped being a sacred place and became abandoned territory. I stopped looking in the mirror, stopped touching myself, stopped allowing myself to want. Pleasure became a distant idea, almost abstract. Something that, in my world, simply didn't exist. Still, I stayed. I stayed because it was what was expected, because I was afraid of making a scene, because my children needed stability, and deep down, I believed I didn't deserve more than that this was just how it was, that being a woman meant giving until you ran dry, that there was no more passion after 50, or after kids, or after so many silent nights. I convinced myself that mature love was quiet, and that pleasure was just a detail in books. And I kept going, day after day, year after year, until one day, at 65, I looked at my own hands and didn't recognize myself in them anymore. That was when the kids had grown and moved out. The kitchen went quiet, the hallway empty, the bed bigger than ever. And there I was, alone with myself. At first the silence hurt, then it became company. And in that space, something started to grow. A small, unsettling, persistent question. What if there's still time? I tried to ignore it, but it kept growing. With each morning, each trip to the market, each night I lay in bed and didn't miss anyone, not even him. That's when I realized I didn't miss my husband. I missed myself. Asking for the divorce felt like opening a window after decades of drawn curtains. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't complicated. Robert didn't plead, didn't argue, didn't even seem surprised. He just accepted it, with the same indifference he had shown throughout our entire life together. And somehow, as sad as that was, it also set me free. It was as if I finally had permission to begin again. And at 65, I did. I moved into a smaller house in a cold and quiet town where almost no one knew me, a place where I could be whoever I wanted to be, or better yet, where I could discover who I truly was for the first time. And that's how it all began. With silence, with space, with courage. I didn't yet know what was coming. I had no idea who I would meet. But something in the air felt different, as if life was preparing something for me, something that didn't yet fit into words, something that, until then, I thought only existed in other women's stories. I used to think starting over would feel like writing a brand new story, but I've learned that sometimes it's more like rereading the old one with different eyes. Life in that small town began to settle into a different rhythm. The cold became company, and I, who once hated silence, started hearing things I'd never noticed before. The whistle of the kettle, the crackle of wood in the fireplace, the soft creak of the floorboards. They were the sounds of a living house, even if it was just my presence inside. Sometimes I'd sit by the window with a blanket on my legs and a cup in my hands, and just be, just breathe, just exist. Little by little, I started walking around the neighborhood. There was a small bookstore on the main street, with an old sign and a window full of used books stacked without order. I stepped in for the first time without hurry. My hands slid along the worn spines, the smell of aged paper, covers marked by unknown fingers. I felt a strange peace, a light happiness. And that's when I saw him, from afar only, leaning on the counter, laughing at something the clerk had said. He wore a dark blue wool coat, had short white hair, and a calm presence that caught my attention without knowing why. Our eyes didn't meet, but I noticed him, and I went home with a book and a new thought. The next day, I ran into him at the bakery. We were in line. He was in front of me and let me go ahead when he noticed I only had a small loaf of bread and a jar of jam in my hands. He gave me a light smile and said, "After 60, kindness becomes a priority, doesn't it?" I smiled back, surprised by how sweet that simple phrase was, and that was it, nothing more. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't about him. It was about me, about realizing that my body still responded to a kind look, that my heart, even after being so quiet for so long, still knew how to beat differently. I kept seeing him over the next few days, as if the universe had decided to play with coincidences, at the market, at the cafe, at the bookstore again. Small encounters that didn't feel like accidents, but also didn't rush to become anything more. And I, for the first time, wasn't pressuring myself about it. I wasn't creating expectations. I was just feeling. It was like I was relearning how to connect with the world, and with what I felt. A shy smile had the same weight as a confession. A simple good morning could warm me more than a hug. It was a different time. My time. At home, I started looking at myself in the mirror with more patience, not with vanity, but with curiosity. I began caring for my hair, my skin, the clothes I chose to wear, even if I was just walking to the corner. It wasn't to please anyone. It was for me, to feel like I was still here, that I was still made of presence, of touch, of waiting. I didn't know his name yet, but I already knew he made me remember parts of myself that had fallen asleep, and that deserved to wake up. gently. That season of my life was just like the town I lived in, cold on the outside, but full of warmth hidden in the details. And between a hot coffee and fresh bread, between an old book and a new smile, something in me began to open, not like someone falling in love, but like someone finally allowing life to come close again. I've always had a quiet relationship with books. Even during the hardest years, they were my refuge, my secret space. Maybe that's why I kept going back to that bookstore, like someone searching for shelter. It was a small place, warmed by an old heater in the corner and the soft sound of pages turning. On one of those visits, he appeared again. He was sitting at a table in the back, a coffee at his side, and his glasses sliding down his nose. When he saw me, he smiled naturally. It wasn't an invitation. It was recognition, as if to say, without words, "Oh, you like comfortable silence too." The woman who owned the store, who already knew my name, introduced me to him without formality. "Walter is our most loyal customer and our pickiest reader." He laughed, without arrogance. "Picky is a polite way of saying grumpy," he replied. We all laughed, and that laughter was more than friendly. It felt light. It was a relief. I'd been trapped in formalities and distance for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply laugh. He asked if I knew any of Raymond Carver's short story collections. I said I knew them all, and that I had a favorite. The conversation flowed naturally, like a casual coffee between old friends. In the following days, we kept running into each other and talking more. He always had a book in hand and a question ready. He wanted to know what I thought about certain endings, about characters who gave up, about stories that didn't tie everything up. I answered with honesty, and he listened with interest. Walter was different. He didn't interrupt. He didn't wait for the pause just to give his own opinion. He listened like someone collecting words spoken with truth. And that threw me off, because I wasn't used to being heard like that. Not by Robert, not by anyone. One day, he told me he was an editor for a cultural journalism website. He'd spent his life working with text, editing, reading, and he still kept active, even after retiring. He said he liked small stories, the ones that didn't seem big enough for a novel but held the most important things inside. I looked at him and said, "I think I'm one of those small stories." He looked back at me with kindness and said, "Maybe you're just starting your second chapter." That sentence stayed with me like a soft echo. And for the first time, I wanted to believe it. At home, I started writing again. Not long texts, just fragments, memories, sensations, scattered words, as if my body was opening from the inside. It wasn't writing with a goal, but it pulsed with life. I wrote about hands without hurry, about eyes that saw deeply, about what time does to us and what it can still undo. And I noticed that thinking of Walter awakened something I had forgotten. Not just desire, but tenderness. Not just the touch, but the longing to be touched with truth. And that to me was new. I didn't know if he felt the same, and I didn't need to know yet. The truth was, just imagining that someone could see me as more than a quiet, aging widow was already freeing. I was relearning how to exist, and maybe how to be desired. But slowly, with poetry, with the right body and the right time. The next morning, I went out for a walk earlier than usual. The ground was still damp from the frost the night before, and a thin fog spread across the rooftops like a delicate blanket. I liked that kind of weather, cold enough to ask for a heavy coat and a soft scarf, but not cruel. It was the kind of cold that made you pay attention to every step. And during that aimless walk, I heard a voice behind me. "You're an early riser too, huh?" I turned. It was him. Walter, with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat and a calm smile on his face. He caught up to me with slow steps. We walked side by side for a few minutes without saying a word, just listening to the sound of boots on the pavement and the wind slicing between the trees. Sometimes company doesn't need conversation, but that day he broke the silence with something that touched me in an unexpected way. "Marilyn, you seem like someone who carries a lot inside but has learned to walk light." I didn't answer right away. It hit me deep, because he was right, and no one had ever said that to me like that, as if he could see my entire story in a single gesture. We sat on a bench in the square near the old bandstand. He asked me if I missed something I never lived. That question undid me, because I did. I missed a kind of touch I never knew, a kiss without fear, a night without rush. I missed being looked at with hunger and care at the same time. And I missed allowing myself to feel pleasure without guilt. I responded to him with a long gaze, and maybe he understood. Maybe he felt it. Or maybe he just respected the silence I needed in that moment. He didn't push, didn't steer the conversation somewhere uncomfortable. He simply changed the subject. We started talking about the trees in the square, about how autumn was his favorite season, about how leaves knew how to fall with more elegance than many people knew how to leave. I laughed, lightly, and deep inside, I was grateful. Walter was the kind of man who knew when to step back, and also knew when to stay, and that was new to me. Before we said goodbye, he looked at me gently and said, "You have a beautiful way of being in the world, even without saying much." I smiled, and my face warmed, even with the morning wind brushing against it. I walked home with a different feeling. It wasn't euphoria, it was peace. A peace that came from knowing something was beginning. Not a rushed romance, but a kind of connection that grows from the inside out, and that respects the rhythm of a heart that's been hurt, but still wants to beat stronger. And that afternoon, alone at home, I did something I hadn't done in years. I left music playing in the living room, poured myself a glass of wine, and danced slowly. Just me. With myself. Because even if Walter didn't know it yet, he had given me back the desire to exist in my own body. And that was the beginning of everything. The week went by like someone trying not to disturb something beautiful. No rush, no urgency. Walter and I kept running into each other almost by chance. At the market, the cafe on the corner, the bench in the square where the wind seemed gentler. Our encounters became quiet rituals. He always brought a new book or a comment about something he'd read that reminded him of me. And I started smiling even before I saw him. It was strange to recognize anticipation in myself. I, who had gone decades without expecting anything from anyone, now felt my heart warm just knowing I'd see him. Walter wasn't the type to flatter with exaggeration, but there was truth in every word he said. "You have a way of looking at people that doesn't judge," he told me once, as we shared a slice of pie. "And that makes me want to tell you everything." I went quiet for a few seconds, absorbing those words, because that's exactly how I felt with him, that I could be who I was, with my silences, my pauses, my untold stories. I didn't need to decorate myself or hide anything, and that was so rare. We started allowing ourselves a little more. He'd walk me to my front door. Sometimes he came in, had some tea, stayed a little, sometimes not, and that was okay. The intimacy grew in the in-betweens, in the care, in the way he watched me choose words, in the way I waited for the sound of his laugh. And one of those cold afternoons, he touched my hand for the first time. We were sitting side by side on the couch, reading excerpts from a book out loud, when our fingers met on the armrest. He didn't pull away, neither did I. We just stayed there, hands barely touching, as if to say, I'm here, and that alone is everything. The touch was subtle, but my whole body responded, not with urgency or anxiety. It was like a warm wave, gentle, that reminded me of myself, of what I felt, of what I could still feel. And right then, I understood that desire doesn't die with time, it sleeps. And when it wakes up, it needs to be welcomed with calm, with tenderness, with respect. That night, after he said goodbye, I went to the mirror and looked at myself differently, not searching for flaws or signs of age, but as someone who sees light in her own eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, just looking at the reflection. But I remember smiling and thinking that, at 66, I could still rediscover myself. And more than that, I could still be discovered. That day, I wrote in my blue notebook, with steady hands, there is pleasure in a gentle touch. There is warmth in being truly heard. There is desire without urgency. There is love that begins with respect. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew I didn't want to stop it. Little by little, he became part of my daily life, without intruding. Walter was presence, not possession. He didn't come over every day, but he always called when he didn't. He had that rare gift of knowing when to show up and when to give space. And I, who had spent years being watched, judged, and pushed into roles that never fit me, began to understand what freedom in companionship meant. He respected my rhythm, and the more he respected it, the more I wanted to be near him. One rainy, chilly Sunday afternoon, he showed up with a basket of bread and a bottle of wine. Today feels like a day for coziness, he said, smiling, his glasses slightly crooked and his hair damp from the rain. I made a simple soup, and we ate in the kitchen, laughing at his stories about editing mishaps he'd seen in the papers. The house felt small for so much lightness, and I realized that laughing with someone is a powerful way to undress. Without removing a thing, you surrender. After dinner, we sat by the fireplace. He took off his shoes and put his feet up on a cushion, as if he already belonged there. I sat next to him, a blanket across both of us, sharing the warmth. We stayed quiet for a while, listening to the crackle of the firewood, until he said, "Can I tell you a secret?" I nodded, curious. It's been years since I've felt at home anywhere. But here, right now, I think I found it. That unraveled something inside me, because I was also starting to feel that, for the first time, someone saw me as a refuge, not as a role. He wrapped an arm around me and pulled me gently closer. My body hesitated for a moment, then allowed itself. Leaning into him felt like stepping into warm water after a lifetime in the snow. It wasn't about the touch itself. It was about the gentleness, the space, the care held in that gesture. His head rested against mine, our eyes closed, and everything in that moment was good silence. There was no kiss that night, no rush, no urgency. But there was surrender. There was recognition. There was the beginning of something that doesn't hurry, because it knows the value of what it holds. And deep in my chest, I felt I was about to experience something that isn't measured in intensity, but in depth. Like someone diving, and only afterward realizing how much they needed that plunge. As he left, he looked at me for a long moment and simply said, "Thank you." And that was it. No promises, no drama, just presence. I closed the door slowly and stood there, leaning against the wood, still feeling his warmth on me. And I thought, maybe love after 60 is the only kind of love that asks for nothing but truth. The following weeks felt like a delicate fabric being stitched, thread by thread. Walter and I began to share not just coffee and conversation, but comfortable silences, slow walks, pages read side by side, and even recipes. One afternoon, he brought me an apple cake he'd made using his mother's old recipe. It was uneven and crooked, but delicious. "I made it thinking of you," he said. And that phrase, so simple, warmed me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It was beautiful to be remembered, to be the inspiration for a gesture, no matter how small. Our bond deepened in the details. He could tell when I was tired just by the sound of my voice. I knew when he needed silence, even when he smiled. We became companions in a quiet way. There were no labels, no urgency, but something was growing between us, something my body recognized before my mind did. It was as if my cells had begun to wake up. A hand on my shoulder, a lingering hug, a gaze held a second longer. Everything seemed to carry a calm, present kind of desire. One cold night, he invited me to have dinner at his house. I said yes without hesitation, but when I arrived and saw the table set with 2 deep bowls, a glass of wine for each of us, and a simple candle in the center, something inside me trembled. Not from fear, from awareness. I realized we were stepping into something new, and that he was welcoming me not as a friend, but as someone he had been waiting for. The food was warm, the room cozy, and the old jazz record playing in the background seemed to know more about us than we did. After dinner, we sat on the couch. He offered me a blanket, and we stayed there, side by side, our feet almost touching. We spoke little, just enough. Then he took my hand and said, "You know what I like about you, Marilyn? You give me back time. With you, everything slows down. And that is rare." I smiled but couldn't find words, because I felt the same, and because nothing needed to be said. He leaned in slowly and kissed my cheek, a kiss that asked for nothing, but still said everything. In that moment, I understood that our bodies hold memory, even when we try to forget. And mine remembered. It remembered what it was like to be touched with care, what it was like to be seen with tenderness. And more than that, it was beginning to understand what it meant to be wanted with respect. Walter never rushed me, and that was what made me want to stay even more. Because there was no pressure, there was patience, there was care, and it was exactly that care that allowed desire to grow freely. I went home that night with my fingers still wrapped around his, and my heart calm. Because unlike other phases of my life, I didn't feel anxious or uncertain. I felt present. I felt I was exactly where I needed to be, and that something was about to bloom, not like an explosion, but like a garden after winter. The following week, it rained almost every day, and I missed him. I missed our rituals, our shared silences, the way he looked at me like someone admiring a flower as it begins to bloom. Then, on a Friday afternoon, he called and said, "If I bring tea and a blanket, can I visit you?" I smiled to myself before answering, "You can." When he arrived, he was wet from the rain, his hair more tousled than usual, and his smile even gentler. He brought 2 books, a box of cookies, and the promised blanket. It was the kindest gesture anyone had made for me in a long time. We spent the afternoon in the living room. The fireplace was lit, the cookies warm, the sound of rain on the window like a movie soundtrack. He sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, and I sat right behind him, legs crossed, reading out loud a passage from a novel we both liked. The scene was simple, but full of presence. I felt my entire body there, awake, open, light. And then he slowly turned to me, looked into my eyes and asked softly, "Can I kiss you?" There was no urgency in the question, only reverence. I answered with a simple gesture, and he leaned in. The kiss was calm, warm, full of care. It was a kiss that taught me pleasure doesn't need to be loud. That desire, when it's mature, doesn't invade, it welcomes. My lips met his with an almost sacred recognition. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just my body being touched. It was my story, my absence, my emptiness, my silence. And all of that, when touched with respect, began to transform. We didn't go further that night, and that was beautiful. He held my hands, kissed my forehead, and said, "I want to live this with you, on your time." And that's when I realized how precious it is to experience something like that. A love that doesn't rush, a tenderness that doesn't demand, a desire that blooms slowly. I, who had spent a lifetime not knowing my own body, began to understand that pleasure doesn't live in urgency or expectation. It lives in surrender, in listening, in the kind of touch that asks before it happens. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, with my heart at peace. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, smiling. I remembered his words, the kiss, the warmth of the fireplace, the rain as background music, and most of all, the way he looked at me, as if I was whole, even with the broken parts. I went to the bathroom mirror and saw myself differently, not younger, but alive, full, awake. And that same day, I wrote again in my notebook, "Pleasure isn't an act, it's a space where I can exist without fear, and where, finally, I let myself be touched, for real." The days after that kiss felt different. Even the routine carried a quiet glow. Coffee tasted warmer, books more captivating, the sounds of the city softer. Walter remained the same calm man, but now there was a new tenderness between us. He touched me with the tips of his fingers, like someone handling an old, precious page. And I felt my whole body respond. Not with shame, not with insecurity, but with curiosity. It was as if I was meeting myself for the first time, with him and with me. I started to remember old moments with new eyes, not to hurt, but to understand. I remembered nights when I was touched without being seen, times when pleasure ended before it even began. I remembered the silence after loveless sex. I remembered crying in the shower and pretending I was just tired. And as I remembered all of that, I didn't feel guilt. I felt grief, because they were pieces of me I never truly lived. And now, so late, and yet right on time, I was finally ready to live them. On Friday, he invited me to spend the weekend in a cabin he had rented in the mountains. Just a simple place. But there's a fireplace, books, and silence. I smiled. It was everything I needed. I packed a small bag, and for the first time in a long while, I carefully chose the clothes I would take. Not to please anyone, but to feel good in my own skin. I put on a wool sweater I'd always saved for special occasions. And for the first time, I understood that I was the special occasion. We arrived near sunset, with the sky painted in orange and snow falling lightly over the tree branches. The cabin was cozy. Wooden floors, a bookshelf full of books, large windows facing the valley. We lit the fireplace, made some tea, and sat on the couch, just like so many other times. But that night, the silence between us was different. A silence that didn't feel heavy. It simply announced what was about to happen. He looked at me for a long while, like he was photographing me with his eyes, as if he wanted to memorize every detail of the woman I had become. And then, with a calmness that moved me, he reached out his hand. "Can I take you with me? Not to a place, but to a moment, to a kind of surrender." I followed him to the bedroom. The light was soft, the heater humming. He started by removing my shoes. Then he held my face in both hands and kissed my forehead, my cheeks, the corners of my mouth. He touched my skin with such delicacy that I closed my eyes and let the air out slowly. Every gesture was a question, and every yes my body gave was both new and familiar, as if I had been waiting for this my whole life. There was no rush, no script, only presence, listening, desire, and above all, respect. And when, for the first time in my life, I felt my whole body vibrate with pleasure, not that fast, empty kind I used to know, but a pleasure that came from deep within, that held every part of me with care, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief, because I had finally been touched with truth, because at 66 my body wasn't ignored, it was celebrated, and I didn't need to hide. I was desired and loved completely. We woke up still wrapped in each other, the room filled with a soft light filtering through the curtains. Walter was sleeping with one arm around my waist, his breathing slow and peaceful. And for the first time in decades, I woke up without fear, without guilt, without pain. I felt my skin warm, my muscles loose, my heart at peace. I stayed there quiet for a long time, just listening to the sound of him sleeping, and the new sound within me, the sound of someone who finally belongs to herself. I got up gently and went to the kitchen, made coffee, opened the window, and let the cold air in. The view was breathtaking, everything white, silent, untouched. It felt like the world had also woken up different. When he appeared behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, I closed my eyes and smiled. "Sleep well," he whispered. "Better than ever," I replied. And it was true. I had never slept after a real encounter. Never had my body rested so fully. We spent the day together as if time didn't exist. Lazy readers in front of the fire, hands held in silence, quiet laughter over lunch. But the most beautiful part was what went unspoken. The looks, the calm between two bodies that recognize each other without needing proof. He asked if I was okay, brought me tea, touched my hand from time to time, looked at me like he was saying, "I love who you are, and everything you've allowed yourself to become." That Saturday afternoon, while he read with his head resting on my lap, I looked at him and felt something that went beyond romantic love. It was gratitude for waiting for my time, for showing me to myself, for giving my body back its right to feel. He looked up at me and smiled, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. "You have the most beautiful body I've ever seen," he said. "Not on the outside, but inside." It told me a story, and I want to hear that story until the end. I cried again, silently. At the end of the day, we walked the trail behind the house, our hands joined, our steps slow. It was an ordinary weekend, and yet extraordinary, because he gave me something that can't be bought, taught, or faked: the permission to exist with pleasure, the permission to desire without guilt, to climax without fear, to love without armor. That night, before going to sleep, I wrote in my blue notebook, "What begins with respect can end in miracle." And my miracle has a name, warm hands, and knows exactly how to touch me without hurting. Coming back home after that weekend felt like opening a door that would never close the same way again. The town was the same, the streets, the silence, but I wasn't. There was a deep, quiet change inside me, almost invisible to others, but undeniable within. It was as if I had been reborn from the inside. Not in the dramatic sense of the word, but in the truest one. I had, finally, recognized myself. And it was with that new body, that new gaze, that new story that I walked now through the cold sidewalks of my routine, Walter and I kept seeing each other, but without turning it into a schedule. We didn't need commitment in the traditional sense. His presence was in everything, even on the days we didn't meet. He was the kind of man who stayed, even when he wasn't there. A note left in the mailbox, an old photo sent by text, a comment about a song that reminded him of me. He knew how to be present, with lightness. And I, who had always been a woman who erased herself for others, was finally learning what it meant to add someone to my life, without losing myself. Little by little, people around me started to notice. At the bakery, a woman stopped me and said, "There's something different about you. You look lit from within." I smiled without explaining. At home, I reorganized the closets, gave away old clothes, hung a new painting in the living room. I started wearing perfume again, took care of my nails, my skin, my hair, not out of shallow vanity, but because after so many years, my body had become a home again, not a prison. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see youth, I saw presence. And for me, that was more beautiful than anything else. It was my daughter Elaine who noticed first. "Mom, your voice sounds different. Softer. Are you okay?" I smiled, with that kind of smile that doesn't need explaining. "I'm learning how to stay." She looked at me with affection, but also with a bit of surprise. Like she was meeting another woman, one who had always been there but never truly shown herself. And maybe that's exactly what it was. For the first time, my children were seeing who I really was. Not just their mother, but the woman, the person. And that discovery was as new to them as it was to me. Walter met Elaine not long after. It was a simple lunch at home, nothing formal. He brought me flowers and a carrot cake he had made himself. The two of them got along well, but I noticed the careful look in my daughter's eyes, that silent kind of watching from someone who wants to protect. When she left, she hugged me longer than usual and whispered in my ear, "If he makes you feel like this, then I'm glad he showed up." And that moved me more than I could explain. That night, as Walter and I walked to the gate, he held my hand and said, "You feel more whole. I see it." And I simply replied, "It's just that now, for the first time, no one's cutting me into pieces anymore." The following Sunday, I had an unexpected visitor, Benjamin, my middle son. He arrived with a shy smile and a box of pastries from the bakery we used to go to when he was little. "I came to see you, Mom. You look different, and I needed to see it with my own eyes." We laughed. He came in, complimented how the house smelled, and sat on the couch with a kind of ease that brought back memories. I made coffee, cut a slice of cake, and we sat down to talk like we hadn't in a very long time. He looked at me calmly and asked, "Who is he?" I didn't try to hide it. I spoke about Walter with an open heart. I said he was someone who had taught me how to listen to myself again, that he didn't come to save me, but to remind me of who I was. Benjamin smiled, emotional. "I'm so happy for you. I always felt like Dad. Never really knew how to love you the way you deserved." That hit me deeply, because for the first time, one of my children was recognizing my past pain and my present courage. I told him that at 66, I had discovered what pleasure really meant. I said it naturally, without shame. He listened with respect, eyes glassy. "Mom, if anyone doubts that you can love again after 60, just tell them to talk to you." We laughed. It was a moment of healing, a bridge between generations, between the woman I had been and the children I had raised. And in that moment I realized my story wasn't just mine, it was also theirs. And by freeing myself, in a way, I was also freeing them from the image of a mother who had faded. Walter arrived later that afternoon and was greeted by Benjamin with a hug. I stood watching the two of them talking on the porch like old friends. And in that moment, I saw my whole life rearranging in front of me. Not like a forced restart, but like a new chapter written in truthful words. For the first time, there was no guilt, no secrets, no painful silences, just presence, just continuity. That night, already alone, Walter asked me if I was afraid of anything. I thought for a few seconds and answered, only of forgetting myself again. He held my face with both hands and said, if it's up to me, that will never happen. We kissed slowly, and we slept in peace, like people who had found shelter and recognized themselves there. And before I fell asleep, I wrote another page in my blue notebook. This time, I chose myself. And that's why everything is in its place. The days that followed carried a lightness I never thought could exist in my routine. It wasn't exaggerated happiness or euphoria. It was something else, a kind of quiet peace, a joy that didn't shout, but followed me from the moment I woke up to the moment I lay down. Walter was part of my life with the same natural ease as sunlight entering through the morning window, never asking for permission, always welcome. He knew what I liked, respected my silences, and made sure I always knew I mattered. We started sharing everyday things, grocery shopping, a walk in the park, afternoons at home reading side by side. Sometimes he'd stop by just to kiss me and leave. Sometimes he stayed for dinner, and on some more special nights, he'd sleep beside me, in silence, with our hands intertwined. We weren't in a hurry to label anything. We didn't need to. Our bond wasn't built on titles, but on care, on presence, on truth. One afternoon, I got an unexpected message. It was from Robert, my ex-husband. Just one line. I'll be in town for a few days. Can we talk? I felt a chill, not of fear or longing, but of surprise. Robert had never been the type to reach out, never tried to explain anything. I spent the rest of the day wondering if I should answer. I talked to Walter that night. He listened without interrupting, then looked into my eyes and said, "Do what feels right. I'll be here." And in that kind of support, without control, I was once again reminded of the difference between a love that suffocates and a love that sets you free. The next day, I replied, and we arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown. I arrived first, chose a table by the window. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older, more hunched over, with tired eyes. He sat across from me and greeted me formally. After a few seconds of silence, he said, "You look different." I just gave a small smile. He went on, "I heard you're seeing someone. I just wanted to know if you're okay." That question caught me off guard, not because of the kindness in it, but because for the first time, he actually seemed to care. I told him, yes, I'm okay. I've found someone kind. I've learned how to take care of myself. I discovered that it's still possible to love and to be loved. He listened quietly, nodding slowly, then sighed. "I never knew how to love you, Marilyn, and I think I'm only now realizing what I lost." That moved me, but it didn't hurt, because I didn't need that validation anymore. What used to hurt was now just memory. I looked at him and said, "You didn't lose me now. You lost me the moment you chose not to see me." He nodded, and it was clear there was nothing more to be said. But there was something important in that moment. I wasn't there to forgive or to accuse. I was there whole. For the first time, I was the one telling my story. I came home with a calm heart, no bitterness, no resentment, just the certainty that I had changed, that the woman who once begged for silence and learned to live in it now knew how to listen to herself, and that Walter's love was part of that, but the strength to begin again was mine. That weekend, I told Walter about my meeting with Robert. He listened carefully, without showing discomfort. He simply held my hand and said, "You're so brave, Marilyn. So whole. I admire you." That touched me more than any compliment about beauty or charm, because that's what I was seeking now, to be seen for the woman I had become, not for a body, not for an image, but for the truth I carry inside me. We decided to spend Saturday away, just the two of us. We went to a nearby town, had lunch at a small restaurant, walked down a cobblestone street, laughed at silly little things. At one point, he stopped in front of a shop window filled with vintage picture frames. He picked one up and said, "I think it's time we had a photo of us, don't you?" I laughed, shy and surprised. "Now?" "Now," he replied, with that gentle smile of someone who knows how to wait, but also knows when the moment calls for action. We stepped into an old photography studio. The photographer asked us to stand however we liked. Walter wrapped his arm around my waist, and I rested my head on his shoulder. When the shutter clicked, we were already smiling. Not because we had to, but because we couldn't help it. It was quiet happiness, presence, a memory being created right then, in that instant. When we picked up the photo a few hours later, I stared at it for a long time. It was the image of two mature bodies, but two living souls. And for the first time, I felt truly beautiful. Back home, I placed the photo on the living room shelf, between books, candles, and dried flowers. There it stayed, not as a symbol of a couple, but as a symbol of a story of reconnection, of beginning again. Walter made tea while I arranged the blanket on the couch. We sat side by side, our hands intertwined, and he said, "Marilyn, you are my favorite place in the world." His words moved through me with gentleness, and there, on that cold, late afternoon, I felt like it didn't matter what was still to come, because what we already had was more than I'd ever known. After he left, I wrote in my blue notebook, "What I lived with Robert was survival. What I live with Walter is existence. It's being whole, it's being, without having to shrink to fit." And in that moment, I knew that no pain from the past had power over me anymore. Because the kind of love that heals doesn't erase what came before, but it transforms everything that comes after. Winter was slowly starting to say goodbye when Walter invited me to visit the cabin in the mountains again. Just the two of us, like the first time. But now, no more discoveries, just celebration. I accepted without hesitation. The suitcases were smaller, the silences lighter. It felt like we were finally living inside what we had built. There was no longer the chill of the unknown, nor the restlessness of first times. There was warmth, a shared rhythm, and above all, a tenderness only mature love can cultivate. We arrived by late afternoon. Golden light streamed through the bare branches like a memory of fall. We walked along the trail behind the house and sat on a large rock, facing the valley. He pulled a new notebook and a pen from his backpack. "I want us to start writing together. It doesn't have to be perfect or beautiful, just true." I took the notebook with steady hands. I wrote just one sentence. "I am someone else, and still myself." He smiled, took the pen, and wrote beneath it, "And I love you exactly as you are." We went back inside, had a simple soup for dinner, and that night we made love again, without ceremony, but with reverence. Every part of my body seemed to remember that it was welcome. There were no lights on, no music, just breath, just hands, just murmurs that didn't need to become words. For the first time, I felt there was no fear, no lingering shadow of giving too much. I received, with joy, with presence, with pleasure. Afterward, we lay in silence, arms around each other, eyes closed, our bodies still warm. Walter gently caressed my shoulder and whispered, "Did you know you could still feel all of this?" I shook my head, tears in my eyes. No, but now I know I can, and that I want to. He pulled me closer and said, "Your story taught me to respect time, and the most beautiful time I know is with you." The next morning, before heading back, we returned to that same rock on the trail. We left a small wooden box there, filled with notes we had written for each other. Words about rediscovery, courage, freedom. It wasn't a pact, it was a keepsake. For ourselves, or for anyone who might one day stumble upon it. Words left in the world like seeds. Because when love is lived truthfully, it doesn't need to be kept only between two people. It can touch time, it can reach others. On the drive home, holding hands in the car, I felt something I had never felt in any previous relationship. Peace. It wasn't dependence. It wasn't expectation. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you found a love that doesn't limit, doesn't suffocate, doesn't demand, but reaches out and walks alongside you. In the months that followed, our life continued in the most beautiful way possible. Simple. Walter slept over a few nights a week. We had our habits, our favorite tea, our quiet places. We still visited the bookstore, still walked in the park. But now, more than ever, we lived inside a silent harmony. It felt like everything, inside and out, had finally aligned. My children got used to his presence, each in their own way. Elaine, more reserved, showed affection between the lines. Benjamin adored Walter and was always asking him for book recommendations. David was the last to open up. One day, he called and said he'd been thinking a lot, that he saw a photo of us someone shared in the family group, and that he cried. "You look happy, Mom, and I've never seen you like that." That sentence was a gift, because it wasn't just a son's approval. It was recognition of the woman I am, beyond the role I held for decades. I started writing more often in the blue notebook. Sometimes Walter would read what I wrote. Other times, he'd just run his hand gently over the cover, like someone honoring an altar. In one of the entries I wrote, "It's not that love came late, it's that I was only ready now," and that became our little secret phrase. Sometimes he'd hug me in the morning and say, "Now is now," and I'd smile, because yes, now everything was right on time. One Sunday, we had all 3 kids over for lunch. The table set with care, the smell of food in the air, overlapping conversations, and lots of laughter. At one point, while I washed the dishes and Walter dried, I looked at him and said, "Do you realize how completely my life has changed?" He replied, "No, your life didn't change. It finally appeared." And in that sentence, there was everything. After everyone left, we sat on the porch together. The sky was beginning to darken. And there, at the end of another ordinary day, I understood that happiness isn't a peak. It's a constant, a place inside us where the heart can rest without heaviness. And my heart now was resting in peace. Before bed, I wrote the final sentence in that notebook. At 66, I discovered pleasure. The pleasure of being touched, being heard, being cherished, but above all, the pleasure of finally belonging to myself. Today is a morning like so many others. The kettle sings in the kitchen, light slips gently through the curtains, and the sound of my footsteps in the house no longer unsettles me. It's funny how, after a while, even silence learns how to keep you company. Walter is still sleeping, and I sit watching him with the kind of tenderness only those who loved later in life can understand. It's the kind of love that doesn't cling, it welcomes, that doesn't shout, it holds. A love that arrived when I no longer expected it, and maybe that's what made it feel so sacred. I walk back to the living room and glance at our photo on the shelf, nestled between candles and books. The woman in that picture is no longer the one who once went quiet inside. She's made of scars, yes, but also of beginnings, of discovery, of a kind of pleasure that doesn't live only in the body, but in the courage to live fully. I step closer to the window and see the leaves beginning to change color. Autumn is returning, and I think about how everything has its season, the season of disappearing, the season of rediscovery, and the season of blooming, even when the weather seems against it. I picked up a new notebook the other day. The cover is burgundy, like the coat Walter gave me on our last walk. I haven't written anything in it yet, but today, maybe I will. Because if there's one thing I've learned at 66, it's that life doesn't begin again with noise. It begins in silence, in the touch of a hand, in the gesture of respect, in the moment someone finally calls you by your name and you recognize yourself in it. And now I know. I am Marilyn. I am woman. I am body. I am story. I am pleasure. I am love that arrived late, but arrived whole. And I chose myself.